They thought buying an abandoned Cliffside mansion for $3,500 would solve their money problems. But what Harold and Dorothy Brennan really bought was a secret so dangerous, so valuable, that powerful men had killed to protect it for nearly 40 years. How did two retired mechanics with nothing but grit and each other expose a $290 million criminal conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power? This is their story. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning fog rolled thick off the Oregon coast like wet wool, clinging to everything it touched. Harold Brennan stood at the window of their aging trailer, watching the grey world outside blur and shift. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, 72 years old, shoulders still broad from decades of honest work, but bent now under weight that had nothing to do with age. Behind him, Dorothy sat at their small kitchen table, sorting pills into a weekly organizer. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, not from age, but from the medication she'd been taking since the heart surgery 6 months ago. She was 68, silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, eyes that still sparkled when she smiled, though she hadn't smiled much lately. The bills were spread across the table like accusations, medical invoices in bold red letters, past due notices from the trailer park. A final warning from the mortgage company that held the lien on Harold's old pickup truck. They'd worked their whole lives, Harold and Dorothy. Started as teenagers in auto body shops, her painting, him doing framework. They'd met at a custom car show in 1973, both covered in primer dust, both laughing at something neither could remember now. They'd built a life together bolt by bolt, paycheck to paycheck, raised 2 kids who'd moved away to cities with better jobs, survived recessions, plant closures, and the slow death of small-town manufacturing. But they'd never quite gotten ahead, and now, in what should have been their golden years, they were drowning. Harold turned from the window, his voice quiet but steady. "There's an auction today." Dorothy looked up, pill bottle paused mid-air. "Harold, we can't afford to buy anything." "Might be able to afford this," he said, pulling a crumpled flyer from his shirt pocket. He'd found it tacked to the bulletin board at Gertie's diner, half hidden behind ads for firewood and lost cats. The paper was faded, the ink smeared in places, like someone didn't want it found. Dorothy took the flyer, squinting at the small print. "Property auction, Cliffside Estate, 947 High and Ridge Road." She looked up at him. "That's the old Aldridge place." Harold nodded. "Starts at noon, no minimum bid." "Harold, that place has been empty since before we moved here. There's a reason nobody wants it." "Maybe," he said, sitting down across from her. His knees creaked as he lowered himself into the chair. "Or maybe everybody's just scared of ghosts that ain't there." Dorothy studied the flyer again, her fingers tracing the faded words. The Aldridge property was legend in Crescent Bay, the kind of story people told newcomers to watch their eyes get wide. A massive house built into the cliff face itself, constructed in 1979 by some wealthy developer who disappeared a few years later. The place had sat empty ever since, locked up in legal battles and court orders nobody understood. Kids dared each other to walk up the overgrown driveway. Fishermen claimed they could see lights in the windows some nights, though that was probably just the moon reflecting off broken glass. "What's the opening bid?" Dorothy asked quietly. Harold met her eyes. $500. The silence stretched between them. $500. They had maybe $800 in their checking account, and that was supposed to last until Harold's Social Security check came in 2 weeks. "We can't live in a house on a cliff," Dorothy said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "No," Harold agreed, "but maybe we could sell it, fix it up first if it needs it. We know how to work. We've still got our hands." Dorothy looked down at those hands, her own weathered and scarred from decades of handling paint guns and sanders. Harold's were worse. Knuckles swollen from arthritis, fingers that had been broken and healed crooked more times than either of them could count. But they still worked. They could still build things, fix things. "What if it's falling apart?" she asked. "What if the whole thing slides into the ocean while we're trying to patch it up?" Harold shrugged. "Then we're no worse off than we are now." That was the truth of it. They were already at the edge, already one bad month from losing everything. At least this way, they'd go down swinging. By 11:30, they were driving Harold's old Ford up the coast highway, the ocean churning grey and angry far below. The truck's heater worked intermittently, blasting hot air, then dying, then sputtering back to life. Dorothy had wrapped herself in an old blanket, watching the scenery roll past. Crescent Bay was beautiful in a harsh sort of way. Rocky beaches where the Pacific threw itself against the shore, twisted pines bent permanent by the wind, houses that clung to hillsides like barnacles, weathered and salt-stained. The turnoff for Coast Ridge Road was easy to miss, just a gap in the trees marked by a leaning sign so faded you could barely read it. Harold took it slow, the truck bouncing over potholes and broken pavement. Blackberry bushes had grown over the road in places, scraping against the doors with thorny fingers. "When's the last time anyone drove up here?" Dorothy murmured. "Been a while," Harold said. They climbed higher, the road switching back and forth up the cliff face. Through gaps in the trees, they could see the ocean spreading out below them, vast and indifferent. And then the trees opened up, and they saw it. The house rose from the cliff like it had grown there, all stone and timber and glass. It was massive, far bigger than Harold had imagined. 3 stories at least, maybe 4, with wings extending out over the cliff edge, supported by what looked like steel beams sunk deep into the rock. The architecture was brutal and beautiful at once. All sharp angles and broad windows, designed to withstand Pacific storms and make the ocean itself look small. But it was the condition that shocked them. Harold had expected ruins, broken windows, collapsed roofs. Instead, the structure looked almost pristine. The stone walls showed no cracks. The timber beams were dark with weather but solid. Even the windows, dozens of them, were intact, reflecting the grey sky like mirrors. "Jesus!" Dorothy breathed. "Somebody's been taking care of this place." Harold pulled into what had once been a circular driveway, now cracked and sprouted with weeds, but still recognizable. 2 other vehicles were already there, a county assessor's van and a sedan that probably belonged to whoever was running the auction. A man in a cheap suit stood on the front steps, checking his watch. He looked annoyed and cold, shifting from foot to foot like he wanted this over with. When Harold and Dorothy climbed out of the truck, he barely glanced at them. "You here for the auction?" he called out. "Yes, sir," Harold said, walking closer. "Harold Brennan. This is my wife, Dorothy." The man consulted a clipboard. "Right. Well, you're the only ones who showed. Been standing here an hour." He gestured at the house behind him. "Property's being sold as is by order of the state. Previous owner died intestate. No heirs. Tied up in probate for 38 years. You're buying whatever's here, however it is." "Can we look inside first?" Dorothy asked. The man shrugged. "Knock yourself out. I'll be in my car. Auction starts at noon whether you're done looking or not." He handed Harold a key, old brass, heavy in the palm, and walked back to his sedan without another word. Harold and Dorothy stood at the base of the steps, looking up at the massive front door. It was solid wood, maybe oak, carved with abstract patterns that reminded Harold of waves. "Well," he said quietly, "we came this far." The key turned smoothly in the lock, too smoothly for a door that supposedly hadn't been opened in decades. The mechanism was oiled, maintained. The door swung inward on silent hinges, and they stepped into another world. The foyer was enormous, 2 stories tall, with a spiral staircase winding up to the second floor. The floors were polished stone, covered in places by Persian rugs protected under heavy tarps. Furniture sat throughout the space, shapes hidden under canvas covers. Everything was dusty, yes, but not destroyed, not abandoned. This was a house waiting. "Harold," Dorothy whispered, gripping his arm. "This doesn't make sense. Who's been keeping this place up?" He didn't have an answer. They moved deeper into the house, pulling back tarps to reveal leather sofas, hand-carved tables, artwork still hanging on the walls. The kitchen was massive, commercial-grade appliances from the late 70s, all stainless steel and clean lines. Harold opened the refrigerator. It was off, of course, but clean inside, empty, ready. They found 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves still filled with books. Everything spoke of wealth, of taste, of someone who had poured money and intention into every corner of this place, and then just vanished. Dorothy stood in the library, turning in a slow circle. Why would anyone leave this? Harold was examining the bookshelves, running his hand along the wood. It was solid, expensive, probably custom-built. And then his fingers found something odd, a seam in the wood that didn't match the grain. He pushed gently and felt the panel shift. "Dorothy," he said quietly, "come look at this." She crossed to him, watching as he traced the hidden seam. It ran floor to ceiling, perfectly disguised unless you were looking for it. Harold pushed harder, and the entire section of bookshelf swung inward with a soft click, revealing darkness beyond. They stood frozen, staring into the black space. Harold pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight app, and aimed it into the opening. Stone steps led downward, carved directly into the rock of the cliff. "We should go back," Dorothy said. "Tell the auctioneer." But Harold was already stepping through the opening, drawn by something he couldn't name. Dorothy hesitated, then followed, her hand finding his in the darkness. The stairs descended for what felt like forever, maybe 30 steps, maybe 40. The air grew colder, drier, with a mineral smell like deep caves. Harold's flashlight beam bounced off stone walls that showed tool marks, evidence of drilling and blasting. Someone had carved this space out of solid rock. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a chamber. Harold swept the flashlight around, and they both gasped. The room was maybe 40 feet wide and 60 feet long, with a ceiling high enough to stand in comfortably. The walls were lined with metal shelving units, and on those shelves sat row after row of steel boxes, the kind you'd see in a bank vault. Each box was labeled with a number and a date, all from the early 1980s. In the center of the room sat a desk, and on that desk, a thick ledger bound in leather. Harold approached it slowly, Dorothy pressed close against his side. He opened the ledger with trembling hands. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, columns of numbers, dates, locations. At the top of the first page, written in bold letters, Inventory and Accounts, Marcus Aldridge, January 1985. "That's the man who built this place," Dorothy whispered, "the one who disappeared." Harold flipped through the pages. The numbers were staggering, millions of dollars listed and categorized. He looked at the steel boxes lining the walls, counted at least 50 of them, maybe more in the shadows. "We need to open one," he said. "Harold, we shouldn't. This isn't—" But he was already moving to the nearest shelf, pulling down one of the boxes. It was heavy, 30 pounds at least. He set it on the desk and worked the latches. They opened easily, too easily. Someone had maintained these, too. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in plastic and organized with military precision, were stacks of $100 bills. Not old, yellowed bills, but bills that looked like they'd been printed yesterday. Each stack was bound with a paper band marked $10,000. Harold counted the stacks. 20 of them. $200,000 in a single box. Dorothy made a sound like all the air had left her lungs. Harold reached for another box, opened it. More cash, along with bearer bonds and stock certificates in companies he'd never heard of. A third box held gold coins, gleaming in the flashlight beam, dozens of them. They opened box after box after box. Cash, bonds, gold bars, rare coins, stock certificates, even loose diamonds in small velvet bags. The ledger listed it all, meticulous and precise. Harold found the summary page near the back. Total estimated value as of January 1985, $290 million. $290 million. Harold sat down hard on the stone floor, the ledger falling from his hands. Dorothy stood frozen, one hand covering her mouth, staring at the open boxes, the casual fortunes spilling out across the desk. "This can't be real," she finally whispered. "It's real," Harold said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant and hollow. They sat in silence for a long time, the magnitude of it crushing down on them. Somewhere above, in the normal world, a county official was waiting to auction off a property for $500. Down here, in the dark, they'd found enough money to solve every problem they'd ever had, and every problem their children would ever have, and their grandchildren's children. And then Harold noticed something else. In the corner of the vault, partially hidden by shadow, a red light blinked softly. A camera. Modern. New. Definitely not from 1985. "We need to go," he said, standing quickly. "Right now." Dorothy saw it too, the camera watching them with its unblinking eye. They backed toward the stairs, leaving the boxes open, the money spilling across the desk. Someone was watching. Someone knew they were here. They climbed the stairs faster than they'd descended, Dorothy breathing hard, Harold's bad knee screaming with every step. They burst back into the library, into blessed daylight, and Harold shoved the bookshelf panel closed. It clicked shut seamlessly, invisible again. Through the front windows, they could see the auctioneer still sitting in his car, checking his phone. It was exactly noon. They walked outside on shaking legs, trying to look normal, trying to breathe steady. The auctioneer climbed out of his sedan, still looking annoyed. "Well?" he called. "You want to bid or not?" Harold looked at Dorothy. Her face was pale, eyes wide, but she gave the smallest nod. "Yes, sir," Harold said. "We'd like to bid." The auctioneer sighed, pulled out his clipboard. "Fine. Opening bid is $500. Anyone?" He looked around at the empty driveway, the joke clear in his expression. "Going once, going twice." $3,500, Harold said. The auctioneer blinked. "What?" $3,500, Harold repeated, his voice stronger now. "That's our bid." The man stared at him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Okay then. 3,500. Going once, going twice, sold to Mr. Brennan." He scribbled something on his clipboard. "Congratulations. You just bought yourself a white elephant." They signed the papers in a daze, Harold writing a check that would drain their account to almost nothing. The auctioneer handed them a packet of documents, the deed, tax information, disclosure forms, and drove away without another word, clearly happy to be done with this assignment. Harold and Dorothy stood in the driveway, watching his car disappear down the overgrown road. The house loomed behind them, full of secrets and cameras and 290 million reasons for someone to kill them. "What did we just do?" Dorothy asked. Harold took her hand, squeezed it tight. "I don't know, but we can't tell anyone. Not yet. Not until we figure out what this is." They drove back down the mountain in silence, the ocean churning below them, the weight of their discovery pressing down like the whole cliff might collapse. When they got back to their trailer, everything looked exactly the same bills on the table, the same cracks in the ceiling, the same rust stains in the sink. But everything had changed. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to Dorothy's breathing, shallow and quick, knowing she was awake too. Around 2 in the morning, he heard it. A car engine, moving slowly past their trailer. He got up carefully, moved to the window, peeked through the curtain. A black sedan, no lights, crawled past their lot and kept going. His hands shook as he dropped the curtain back in place. The next morning, Harold drove back to the library in town. an old brick building that smelled like must and floor wax. The librarian, a woman named Martha, who'd been there since Harold and Dorothy first moved to Crescent Bay 20 years ago, greeted him with a smile. "Morning, Harold. What brings you in?" "I'm doing some research," he said, trying to sound casual, "on local history, specifically the Aldridge property up on Coast Ridge Road." Martha's smile faded. "Oh, that place. What do you want to know?" "Whatever you can tell me." She led him to a back room where they kept old newspapers on microfiche, a machine Harold barely knew how to work. But Martha helped him, pulling up articles from the early 1980s. The story emerged in pieces. Marcus Aldridge, real estate developer, had come to Crescent Bay in 1978. Wealthy, charming, full of plans to develop the coastline. He'd bought the cliff property and built his massive house, spending money like water. Locals thought he was eccentric but harmless. Then, in January of 1985, Aldridge disappeared, just gone, overnight. His house sealed up, his businesses abandoned. The sheriff investigated but found nothing. No body, no evidence of foul play, no note. Just an empty house and questions nobody could answer. And then Harold found it. A small article from March of 1985, buried in the back pages. Federal investigators had been looking into Aldridge's business dealings. There were allegations of money laundering, connections to organized crime, illegal real estate schemes. The investigation had gone nowhere after Aldridge vanished. Harold sat back from the microfiche machine, his stomach churning. The money in that vault, it wasn't clean. It was dirty, hidden, blood money from crimes committed 40 years ago. And whoever had been maintaining that house, watching those cameras, they weren't property managers. They were guards, waiting for something or someone. He thanked Martha and drove home, his mind racing. When he walked into the trailer, Dorothy was standing at the sink, staring out the window at nothing. "I got a phone call," she said without turning around, "while you were gone." "Who was it?" They didn't say, just breathed for a few seconds, then hung up. Harold felt ice slide down his spine. "Dorothy?" "I know," she said, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were scared but determined. "Someone knows. Someone's watching us." They stood in their tiny kitchen, the walls seeming to close in. Outside, the normal world continued. Neighbors walking dogs, kids riding bikes, mailmen delivering bills. But for Harold and Dorothy Brennan, normal was over. They'd bought more than a house. They'd bought a secret, and that secret was going to cost them everything, or give them everything, depending on what they did next. That night, they sat at their kitchen table, the documents from the auction spread between them, and made a decision. They couldn't run from this. They couldn't pretend they hadn't found it. The only way forward was through. They would go back to that house. They would document everything. And then they would figure out who was watching, and why, and what the hell Marcus Aldridge had been hiding all these years. But first, they would learn to look over their shoulders. Because in Crescent Bay, on the edge of the Pacific, in a trailer that rattled in the wind, 2 retired mechanics had just become the most dangerous people in town. They just didn't know it yet. The decision to return to the Cliff House came 3 days later, after Dorothy stopped sleeping entirely, and Harold wore a path in their trailer's thin carpet from pacing. They couldn't ignore it. They couldn't unsee what they'd found, and the black sedan had passed their trailer twice more, always between midnight and 3 in the morning, always slow, always watching. Harold called in sick to his part-time job at the hardware store. Dorothy cancelled her volunteer shift at the food bank. They packed a duffel bag with flashlights, his old camera, notebooks, and the kind of determination that comes from having nothing left to lose. The drive up Coast Ridge Road felt different in daylight. Last time they'd been hopeful, desperate, gambling on a future. This time, they were walking into something that could bury them. The house sat waiting, massive and silent against the grey sky. Harold parked in the same spot as before, and they sat for a moment, neither one moving. "We could still walk away," Dorothy said quietly. "Sell the property to someone else. Never come back." Harold looked at her, really looked. Her hands were trembling in her lap. The medication made her tired, made her fragile in ways she'd never been before. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from whatever waited inside that house. But he also knew Dorothy Brennan had known her for 49 years, and she wasn't the kind of woman who ran from hard truths. "You want to walk away?" he asked. She met his eyes. "No, I want to know what we bought, all of it." They entered through the front door, Harold's key turning smoothly in the well-oiled lock. The foyer looked exactly as they'd left it, tarps over furniture, dust dancing in shafts of light from the tall windows. But now they moved with purpose, not wonder. Harold had brought a legal pad and started sketching a rough floor plan, marking rooms as they explored. The main floor held the library, the kitchen, a formal dining room that could seat 20 people, and a living area with a stone fireplace large enough to stand inside. Everything spoke of wealth, but also of loneliness. No family photos, no personal items, just expensive furniture arranged like a showroom. The second floor had 6 bedrooms, each with its own bathroom. The master suite took up the entire east wing, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific. Dorothy stood at those windows, looking down at the ocean crashing 200 feet below, and felt vertigo pull at her stomach. "Harold," she called, "come look at this." He joined her at the window. From this angle, they could see the full scope of how the house was built. The structure extended out over the cliff edge, supported by massive steel beams that disappeared into the rock face. It wasn't just built on the cliff. It was part of it, anchored deep into stone that had stood for millennia. "Whoever built this," Harold murmured, "they weren't planning to leave. This thing could survive an earthquake." They continued to the third floor, which was smaller, just 2 rooms. One was clearly meant as an office, with built-in desks and filing cabinets. The other was locked. Harold tried the key from the front door, but it didn't fit. He was about to give up when Dorothy noticed something. A small panel beside the door, painted the same color as the wall, almost invisible. She pressed it gently and it swung open to reveal a keypad. The numbers were worn, showing which ones had been used most often. 1, 4, 5, 8, 9. "Try 1985, Harold said. The year Aldridge disappeared. Dorothy punched in the numbers. Nothing happened. She tried 8519. Still nothing. Then, on a hunch, she tried 14589. The lock clicked open. The room beyond made them both stop cold. It wasn't an office. It was a command center. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, dozens of them. A desk sat in the middle, and on it an old computer terminal from the 80s, its screen dark, but the power lights still glowing green. Someone had been keeping this equipment running for nearly 40 years. Harold moved to the nearest filing cabinet and pulled it open. Inside were folders, hundreds of them, each labeled with names, dates, and codes. He pulled one at random. Redwood Properties, LLC, June 1982, Alameda County. Inside were property deeds, contracts, bank transfers, all showing real estate transactions in Northern California. Dorothy opened another cabinet. This one held newspaper clippings, all about Marcus Aldridge. Photos of him at charity events, ribbon cuttings, city council meetings. He'd been handsome in a sharp sort of way. Dark hair, expensive suits, the kind of smile that made you trust him even when you shouldn't. But there were other clippings too, ones that told a darker story. Investigations into bid rigging, questions about where his money came from, allegations of connections to organized crime families in Las Vegas and San Francisco. Each clipping was carefully preserved in plastic sleeves, organized by date. He was documenting himself, Harold said, reading over Dorothy's shoulder, keeping a record of everything. They spent the next 2 hours going through files. A pattern emerged, ugly and clear. Aldridge hadn't been a legitimate developer. He'd been a frontman, using dirty money from criminal enterprises to buy properties, then selling them at inflated prices to launder the cash. The scale was breathtaking. Hundreds of properties across California, Oregon, and Washington, purchased between 1978 and 1984. And then Dorothy found the file that changed everything. It was thicker than the others, labeled simply insurance. Inside were photographs, surveillance shots of men in suits getting into expensive cars, meeting in restaurants, handing briefcases to each other. There were transcripts of phone conversations, financial records showing payments to judges, politicians, and police officials. There were names, addresses, bank account numbers. At the back of the file was a letter dated January 3, 1985. It was addressed to the FBI field office in Portland. "Dear Agent Reynolds," it read, in typed letters that had faded but were still legible. "I am prepared to testify regarding criminal activities conducted by the Salazar Organization between 1978 and 1984. In exchange for immunity and witness protection, I can provide documentation of money laundering operations totaling in excess of $290 million, including names of accomplices in state and local government. I am currently in fear for my life and request immediate protection. Marcus Aldridge." The letter had never been sent. It sat in its envelope, unsealed, waiting. "He was going to turn evidence," Dorothy whispered. "He was going to testify." "And they killed him," Harold finished, "before he could." They stared at the letter, the weight of it crushing. This wasn't just money they'd found. It was evidence. Evidence of crimes that had destroyed lives, corrupted governments, and built empires on blood. And someone, somewhere, still wanted it buried. Harold carefully photographed every page in the insurance file, his old camera clicking steadily. Dorothy wrote notes, documenting what they were finding, when, where. They worked in silence, the ocean roaring distantly through the thick windows. And then Harold noticed something else. In the corner of the room, barely visible behind a filing cabinet, there was another camera. Newer than the one in the vault, its red light blinking steadily. They weren't just being watched. They were being recorded, catalogued, tracked. "We need to take this evidence and go," Harold said. "Right now." They gathered the insurance file, along with several others that seemed important, and stuffed them into their duffel bag. Harold made sure to photograph the room itself, the cameras, everything. If something happened to them, at least there would be a record. They left the house quickly, locked it behind them, and drove down the mountain faster than was probably safe. Harold kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights following them, but the road stayed empty. They made it back to their trailer just as the sun was setting, the sky bruised purple and orange over the coast. Inside, they spread the files across their kitchen table, their small space suddenly feeling even smaller with the weight of what they'd brought home. Dorothy made coffee, her hands still shaking. Harold sat down and started reading more carefully, trying to understand the full scope of what Aldridge had documented. The Salazar Organization, he learned, had been a criminal syndicate operating throughout the western United States in the 1970s and 80s. They'd made their money through gambling, drug trafficking, and extortion, but their real genius had been in laundering it. They'd used frontmen like Aldridge to buy legitimate businesses and properties, washing dirty money until it came out clean. $290 million. That's what Aldridge had been holding. That's what was still sitting in that vault, waiting. Harold found a list of names in one of the files, members of the Salazar Organization, their roles, their territories. Most had died or gone to prison decades ago, but not all of them. Harold recognized one name, Vincent Salazar, listed as the organization's financial controller. A quick internet search showed Vincent Salazar was still alive, now in his late 70s, living in a mansion in Napa Valley. Officially retired, officially legitimate. The internet showed photos of him at charity galas, donating to political campaigns, a respected businessman. But Harold now knew the truth. Vincent Salazar had helped build an empire on crime, and he'd never paid for it. The knock on their trailer door came just after 9 that night. 3 sharp raps that made them both jump. Harold moved to the window, peeked through the curtain. A man stood on their small porch, tall, lean, wearing a dark coat. He looked around 50, with the kind of face that had seen things and chosen not to forget them. Harold opened the door, but kept the chain on. "Can I help you?" "Mr. Brennan?" The man's voice was quiet, controlled. "My name is Special Agent Frank Torres, FBI. I need to talk to you about a property you recently acquired." Dorothy appeared behind Harold, her face pale. Harold's mind raced. The FBI? Already? How did they know? "It's about the Aldridge estate," Torres continued. "I know what you found, and I know you're in danger." Harold studied the man's face, looking for deception, for threat. But what he saw was concern, genuine and urgent. "Show me identification," Harold said. Torres pulled out a badge and credentials, held them up to the crack in the door. They looked real, but Harold had no idea what real FBI credentials were supposed to look like. "How do I know you're really FBI?" Harold asked. "You don't," Torres admitted. "But if I wanted to hurt you, I wouldn't knock. I'd wait until you were asleep. I'm here because my office was flagged when the property title transferred. The Aldridge case has been in our cold case files for 38 years. When your name appeared as the new owner, bells went off." Harold looked at Dorothy. She gave a tiny nod. He unchained the door and let Torres inside. The agent looked around their small trailer, his eyes lingering on the files spread across the kitchen table. He didn't touch anything, just observed, his expression carefully neutral. "You found the vault," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Harold admitted. There was no point lying now. "And you removed documents from the property?" "We did." Torres nodded slowly. "Then you need to understand something, Mr. and Mrs. Brennan. Those documents are evidence in ongoing investigations. Taking them could be considered obstruction of justice. But more importantly, having them in your possession puts you in immediate danger." "From who?" Dorothy asked, her voice stronger than Harold expected. "The FBI, or from whoever's been watching that house for 40 years. Torres met her gaze. "Both, potentially, but right now I'm more concerned about the latter." He pulled out a chair and sat down, uninvited but not aggressive. The Salazar organization officially collapsed in 1993. Most of the leadership went to prison or died, but not everyone. And that money, the $290 million Aldridge was holding, it was never recovered. We've always assumed it was gone, spent, hidden somewhere we'd never find it. "Until we found it," Harold said. "Until you found it," Torres agreed. "And the moment you did, the moment those cameras in that house registered movement, alarms went off somewhere. I can guarantee you that." Dorothy sat down heavily. "So, what are we supposed to do? Give it all to you and hope the bad guys don't kill us anyway?" Torres shook his head. "I wish it were that simple. The problem is, we don't know who all the bad guys are. Aldridge's files suggest corruption reached into law enforcement, into courts, into government. Some of those people might still be in power. Some of them might be my colleagues." The room went very quiet. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trailer's thin walls. "So we're on our own," Harold said flatly. "No," Torres said. "You have me. I worked the original Aldridge case in 1985 when I was fresh out of Quantico. It's haunted me for 38 years. All these crimes we knew happened but couldn't prove, all these victims who never got justice. If what you found can finally bring these people down, I'll help you. But we have to be smart. We have to be careful." Harold wanted to believe him. God, he wanted to believe someone official, someone with a badge and authority could make this right. But 49 years of fixing cars had taught him that things were usually more broken than they appeared. "Prove you're on our side," Harold said. "Tell us something we don't know." Torres was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Marcus Aldridge didn't disappear. He was murdered. We found his body in 1997, buried in the foundation of a building in Sacramento. He'd been shot twice in the head. We couldn't prove who did it, but we always suspected Vincent Salazar gave the order." Dorothy's hand found Harold's under the table, gripped tight. "Vincent Salazar," Torres continued, "is still alive, still rich, still protected by lawyers and legitimate businesses. He's untouchable. Unless we can prove he was part of the original conspiracy, unless we can connect him to that money." "We have files," Harold said. "Aldridge kept records, photographs, financial documents, transcripts." Torres leaned forward. "I need to see them, all of them, but not here. Your trailer's not secure." Over the next hour, they made a plan. Torres would arrange a secure location, a safe house where they could go through the evidence properly. In the meantime, Harold and Dorothy needed to act normal, routine, like nothing had changed. No more visits to the Cliff House, no talking to anyone about what they'd found. Torres left just before 11, slipping out into the darkness and disappearing like he'd never been there. Harold and Dorothy sat in the silence he left behind, holding each other, trying to process everything. "Do you trust him?" Dorothy asked. "I don't know," Harold admitted, "but what choice do we have?" They went to bed that night fully clothed, the files hidden in a garbage bag in the crawl space under their trailer. Harold kept a tire iron next to the bed. Dorothy couldn't stop shaking, even under 3 blankets. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by every sound, every creak, every passing car. And then, at 3:17 in the morning by the clock on the nightstand, they heard it. The sound of their front door handle turning slowly, testing to see if it was locked. Harold was up instantly, tire iron in hand, heart hammering. Dorothy grabbed her phone, ready to call 911. They stood frozen in their tiny bedroom, listening. The handle stopped turning. Footsteps moved around the trailer, testing windows, checking the back door. Whoever was out there was thorough, methodical. This wasn't kids playing pranks. This was someone who knew what they were doing. Then, silence. The footsteps stopped. Harold waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, he moved to the window, peeked through the curtain. The black sedan sat in the street, headlights off, engine running. As Harold watched, it pulled away slowly, disappearing into the night. "They know where we live," Dorothy whispered. "They know who we are." Harold pulled her close, felt her heart racing against his chest. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow we call Torres. We do whatever he says. We end this." But tomorrow came with its own horrors. Harold left early to buy groceries, taking his old truck into town. The hardware store, the post office, the market, everything felt normal, routine. He was loading bags into the truck bed when he noticed his brake pedal felt soft, too soft. He pumped it a few times. It went almost to the floor. His hands started shaking. He got down on his knees in the parking lot, looked under the truck. Brake fluid dripped steadily from a cut line, forming a dark puddle on the asphalt. The cut was clean, deliberate. Someone had sliced through the line, probably last night while he and Dorothy were cowering inside. He could have died. If he'd been going down the mountain, if he'd needed to stop fast, if he'd been on the highway, he'd be dead. Harold called Dorothy from the payphone outside the market, his voice shaking so badly he could barely form words. She wanted to come get him, but he told her to stay inside, lock the doors, don't answer for anyone. Then he called Torres. The agent answered on the first ring. "They cut my brake lines," Harold said. "They tried to kill me." "Where are you right now?" "Market parking lot, downtown Crescent Bay." "Stay there. Stay in public. I'm 20 minutes away." Torres arrived in 18. He examined Harold's truck, photographed the cut brake line, then made some calls. Within an hour, Harold's truck was on a tow truck headed for an FBI garage for evidence collection, and Harold was in Torres's unmarked sedan driving back to get Dorothy. "This changes things," Torres said as they drove. "Attempted murder means we move now. No more waiting, no more planning. We're getting you both into protective custody today." "What about the files?" Harold asked. "We'll get them, but you two are the priority." When they got back to the trailer, Dorothy was standing at the window, watching for them. Her face showed the strain of the morning, the fear that had been building for days. Torres came inside, started making calls, arranging their extraction, and that's when the sheriff arrived. Not Torres's colleague, but the local Crescent Bay sheriff, a man named Wade Hollister. He knocked hard on the door, his car parked right behind Torres's sedan, lights flashing. Torres opened the door, badge already out. "Agent Frank Torres, FBI. This is a federal investigation." Sheriff Hollister was in his 50s, thick around the middle, with a face that had seen too many years of small-town politics. "That's real interesting, Agent Torres, because I got a call about suspicious activity at this address, someone breaking into vehicles, harassing residents. What happens next will turn this quiet morning into chaos, expose corruption that runs deeper than anyone imagined, and force Harold and Dorothy to make a choice that could cost them everything. Stay tuned to see what happens. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more." "Nobody's harassing anyone," Torres said calmly. "These people are witnesses in a federal case. They're under my protection." Hollister's eyes narrowed. "Witnesses to what?" "That's classified." "Well, Agent Torres, this is my town, my jurisdiction, and I'm going to need to see some documentation about this federal case you're talking about." Torres and Hollister stared at each other, tension crackling in the small space of the trailer. Harold watched, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. Hollister was too aggressive, too interested. This wasn't normal procedure. And then Harold remembered. In Aldridge's files, there had been a list of local officials on the Salazar payroll. He hadn't paid close attention to the names, but now, standing in his trailer with the sheriff posturing and aggressive, he wondered. "Dorothy," he said quietly, "get the files." She understood immediately, disappeared into the bedroom. Hollister's attention snapped to her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stop right there." "She's getting documentation," Torres said, stepping between Hollister and the bedroom door. "You want to see paperwork? We'll show you paperwork." Dorothy returned with the garbage bag, pulled out the files, started flipping through. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were sharp, scanning names. And then she found it. "Harold," she said, holding up a page. "Look." It was a payment record from August of 1983. $5,000 paid to W. Hollister, Crescent Bay PD, for information and protection. Wade Hollister, the same man standing in their trailer. Harold showed the page to Torres. The agent's expression didn't change, but his hand moved slightly, closer to his hip where his gun was holstered. "Sheriff," Torres said carefully, "I think you should leave." Hollister's face had gone pale, then red. "That's forgery. That's slander." "That's a bank record," Harold said, his fear transforming into anger. "You were on their payroll. You helped them. And you've been watching that house all these years, haven't you? Making sure nobody found what was inside." "You don't know what you're talking about," Hollister said, but his voice had lost its authority. He looked trapped, cornered. "Get out," Torres said. "Now, before I arrest you for obstruction." Hollister backed toward the door, his hand on his radio. "This isn't over. You people have no idea what you've stepped into." He left, tires squealing as he sped away. Torres immediately got on his phone, calling for backup, for support, for whatever cavalry the FBI could send. "We need to go," he said. "Right now. Pack one bag each, essentials only. We're not coming back here." Harold and Dorothy moved fast, throwing clothes and medications into a duffel bag. Dorothy grabbed the photo album from their wedding, the only luxury she allowed herself. Harold took his grandfather's old watch and the brass key from the Cliff House. though he couldn't say why. They were in Torres's car within 10 minutes, the trailer and their old life disappearing in the rearview mirror. The agent drove fast, taking back roads, constantly checking his mirrors. "Where are we going?" Dorothy asked. "Safe house in Portland. Federal protection until we can sort this out." "And then what?" Harold pressed. "We testify? We go into witness protection? We spend the rest of our lives running?" Torres was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "But you've uncovered something bigger than I realized. If local law enforcement is compromised, if people like Hollister have been protecting that site for decades, then the organization never really died. It just went underground." They drove in silence, the Oregon coast rolling past, gray and infinite. Harold held Dorothy's hand, feeling the tremor in her fingers, the fear she was trying to hide. They'd bought a house for $3,500 and found themselves in the middle of a war that had been going on since before they'd even moved to Crescent Bay. The safe house was a nondescript apartment in a low-rise building in southeast Portland. Torres got them inside, checked all the rooms, then sat them down at the kitchen table. "I need to make some calls," he said. "Don't answer the door for anyone. Don't call anyone. Just sit tight." He disappeared into the bedroom, and they could hear his voice, low and urgent, talking to someone about corruption, about evidence, about witness protection. Harold and Dorothy sat at the table, holding hands, not speaking. "I'm scared," Dorothy finally whispered. "Me too," Harold admitted. "Maybe we should give them the money. Tell them where it is, let them take it, and we walk away." Harold shook his head. "They already tried to kill me. You think they'll stop if we cooperate? We're loose ends now. We know too much." Dorothy closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I just wanted to fix our little problems, pay the bills, keep our home. How did it become this?" "Because the world's broken," Harold said. "And sometimes when you try to fix one thing, you find out everything else is broken too." Torres came back, his expression grim. "Okay, I've talked to my superiors. They're taking this seriously. We've got teams moving on Hollister and several other names from those files. We're going to bring down everyone still connected to the Salazar organization." "And us?" Harold asked. "What happens to us?" "You'll testify when the time comes. For now, you stay here, stay safe. We'll provide everything you need." It sounded simple. It sounded like a plan. But Harold had lived too long to believe anything was ever that simple. They spent the next 3 days in that apartment, waiting. Torres brought them food, updates, reassurance. Teams were moving, arrests being made, cases being built. The local news started reporting on a major corruption investigation, though Harold and Dorothy's names were never mentioned. And then, on the 4th night, Dorothy woke Harold at 2 a.m, shaking his shoulder urgently. "Harold, wake up. Something's wrong." He sat up, immediately alert. "What?" "Torres hasn't checked in. He was supposed to call at 10. It's 2 a.m. Harold grabbed his phone. 3 missed calls from an unknown number. His stomach dropped. He called Torres's number. It rang and rang, then went to voicemail. They sat in the darkness, fear crawling up their spines. And then Harold's phone buzzed with a text from that unknown number. "Agent Torres has been compromised. Leave the apartment immediately. Trust no one. Detailed instructions to follow. This is not a joke." Harold showed Dorothy the message. Her face went white. "It could be a trick," she said, "or it could be real." They stared at each other, paralyzed by indecision. Stay and hope Torres was okay? Run and risk walking into a trap? The decision was made for them when they heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy boots, multiple people. Harold grabbed their duffel bag, stuffed the files inside, and pulled Dorothy toward the back bedroom. There was a fire escape, rusty but functional. The front door exploded inward just as they climbed out the window. Harold didn't look back, didn't see who was coming. He just pulled Dorothy down the fire escape, their feet clanging on metal, her breath coming in gasps. They hit the alley running, Dorothy's heart medication forgotten in the apartment, Harold's bad knee screaming with every step. Behind them, they heard shouts, orders, the sound of pursuit. They ran into the Portland night. Two elderly people in their pajamas, carrying everything that mattered in a duffel bag, running for their lives from enemies they couldn't see and allies they could no longer trust. Somewhere in that bag were the files that could bring down a criminal empire. Somewhere in Crescent Bay was a vault with $290 million. And somewhere in the darkness of this city, Harold and Dorothy Brennan had to figure out who to trust before trust got them killed. They'd bought more than a house. They'd bought a war, and the war had finally found them. They ran for 3 blocks before Harold's knee gave out. He stumbled against a brick wall, gasping for air, Dorothy catching him before he fell. The alley smelled like garbage and rain, the kind of Portland rain that never really stops, just shifts between drizzle and downpour. "We can't keep running," Dorothy panted, her face pale in the streetlight. Her hand pressed against her chest, feeling her heart race in ways the doctor had warned her about. "Harold, I can't." He pulled her close, both of them shaking from adrenaline and cold and fear. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had faded, but that didn't mean they were safe. It just meant whoever was chasing them had changed tactics. Harold's phone buzzed again. The unknown number. Another text. "Northeast corner of Burnside and 3rd, white van, 10 minutes, come alone or don't come at all." "It's a trap," Dorothy said, reading over his shoulder. "Probably," Harold agreed. "But what choice do we have?" They made their way through side streets, staying in shadows, avoiding the main roads. Portland at 2:30 in the morning was a different city, populated by people who lived in the margins, the homeless huddled in doorways, late-night workers stumbling home, the occasional police car cruising past. Harold and Dorothy looked like they belonged there now, disheveled and desperate, clutching their duffel bag like it held their last possessions. Which, in a way, it did. They reached the corner with 2 minutes to spare. A white van sat at the curb, windowless, engine running. Harold approached cautiously. Dorothy pressed against his side. The side door slid open, and a woman leaned out, mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, eyes that assessed them in a single glance. "Get in," she said. "Now." Harold hesitated. "Who are you?" "Someone who's risking everything to keep you alive. Agent Torres sent me before they got to him. Now get in before someone spots you." They climbed into the van. Inside were 2 other people, a young man with a laptop and an older man who looked like he'd been military once. The woman slid the door shut, and the van pulled away from the curb smoothly, not rushing, not attracting attention. "I'm Detective Sarah Chen," the woman said. "Portland PD, but I've been working with Torres on this case for 6 months. The kid with the laptop is Marcus, our tech specialist. The guy who looks like he wants to kill someone is retired Marshal Henry Garrett. He's here because Torres called in every favor he had." Harold and Dorothy sat on the floor of the van, trying to process. "What happened to Torres?" Harold asked. Chen's expression darkened. "He was grabbed outside his apartment 4 hours ago. 3 men, professional. We think they're private security hired by Salazar's people. Torres is alive. We're tracking his phone, but they're using him as bait to get to you." "Why?" Dorothy asked. "We're nobody. We're just 2 people who bought a house." "You're the people who found evidence that can put Vincent Salazar in prison for the rest of his life," Chen said. "That makes you the most important people in Oregon right now, and the most dangerous to a man who's spent 40 years building a legitimate empire on blood money." The van drove through the city, taking random turns, doubling back, making sure they weren't followed. Garrett sat near the back doors, a gun resting on his knee, watching through a small window. "Where are we going?" Harold asked. "Somewhere they won't think to look," Chen replied. And then we're going to do what Torres planned before they took him. We're going public. All of it. The files, the money, the corruption. We're going to burn Salazar's world down so completely he won't be able to rebuild it. She pulled out a tablet, showed them a news article from 3 hours ago. FBI agent under investigation for misconduct. Torres's photos stared out from the screen. They were already trying to discredit him, to make anything he'd found look like the work of a rogue agent with an agenda. They're going to do the same to you, Chen warned. They'll call you con artists, thieves, mentally unstable, whatever it takes to make the evidence look questionable. So how do we fight that? Harold asked. Marcus looked up from his laptop. We don't fight it. We overwhelm it. We release everything at once to every media outlet, every platform, every journalist who will listen. We make the story too big to suppress. Garrett spoke for the first time, his voice like gravel. And we do it from the one place they can't ignore, the Cliff House itself. The idea was insane. Return to the property, the one place Salazar's people knew they'd been, the one place that was probably under surveillance right now. But as Harold thought about it, he realized the logic. The house was evidence. The vault was evidence. Standing there, showing the world what they'd found, would make the story undeniable. When? Harold asked. Tomorrow, Chen said. We spend tonight preparing, documenting everything, making copies of copies. Tomorrow at noon, we hold a press conference at the Cliff House. We invite every news organization in the state, and we dare Salazar to stop us. They drove to a storage facility in Gresham, on the outskirts of Portland. Chen had rented a unit under a fake name, stocked it with supplies, equipment, everything they'd need. Inside the small concrete room, they spread out the files Harold and Dorothy had taken from the Cliff House. Marcus set up 3 laptops, started scanning documents, uploading them to encrypted servers scattered across the internet. Even if they kill all of us, he said cheerfully, this information goes live automatically, dead man's switch. Harold watched this young man, barely 30, risk his life for justice he had no personal stake in. Why are you helping us? He asked. Marcus didn't look up from his screen. My mum lost her house in 2008. Foreclosure scam, bank fraud, she never recovered, died 2 years later, broken. I looked into it, found connections to shell companies, to laundered money, to networks that went back decades. Same networks, same people, same crimes, just different victims. He finally met Harold's eyes. So yeah, I'm helping you, because this is my mom's fight too. Dorothy sat down beside Chen, who was organizing documents into piles. You have a family? Dorothy asked quietly. Chen nodded. Daughter, 8 years old. Husband's a teacher. They think I'm working a normal case. They'll be in danger, Dorothy said, because of us. They're already relocated. Protective custody. Torres set it up before... She trailed off, jaw tight. Before they grabbed him. They worked through the night, surviving on gas station coffee and adrenaline. Harold's knee throbbed. Dorothy's hands shook from missing her medication, but they kept going, organizing 40 years of crimes into a narrative that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Garrett stood watch by the door, weapon ready, listening to a police scanner. Twice they heard units dispatched to check out the safe house they'd fled from. Once they heard a description that matched them. Elderly couple, possibly armed, possibly dangerous. They're making us the criminals, Dorothy said, her voice hollow. Only until tomorrow, Chen replied. Tomorrow we become the heroes, or martyrs, hopefully the former. By dawn they had everything ready. The files were scanned, backed up, distributed to journalists they trusted. Chen had reached out to contacts at the Oregonian, Willamette Week, even national outlets. She'd sent them teasers, hints of a massive story about to break, promised them exclusive access if they showed up at the Cliff House at noon. And then Chen made one more call, this one on speakerphone so everyone could hear. It rang 4 times before a smooth voice answered. "Vincent Salazar." Chen took a breath. "Mr. Salazar, my name is Detective Sarah Chen, Portland Police Department. I'm calling to inform you that at 1200 hours today, evidence will be presented to the media regarding your involvement in the Salazar criminal organization between 1978 and 1985. Silence on the other end. Then, "I have no idea what you're talking about, and I suggest you be very careful about making defamatory statements, Detective. The evidence includes financial records, testimony, photographs, and approximately $290 million in currency, bonds, and precious metals currently stored at 947 Coast Ridge Road in Crescent Bay. You're welcome to attend the press conference to refute these allegations in person." She hung up before he could respond. Harold stared at her. "You just told him exactly where we'll be." "Yes," Chen said, "because now he has 2 choices. He can stay away and look guilty, or he can show up and try to discredit us in front of cameras and witnesses. Either way, we win." "Unless he just sends people to kill us before the cameras arrive," Garrett pointed out. Chen nodded. "Which is why we're going early, setting up security and making sure the first news vans arrive by 11. He won't risk a massacre on live television." "You hope," Dorothy said quietly. "I hope," Chen admitted. They left the storage unit at 8 in the morning. 2 vehicles now. Chen's van and a SUV Garrett had acquired from somewhere he wouldn't specify. The drive to Crescent Bay took 90 minutes, the coast highway beautiful and threatening in the early light. As they climbed Coast Ridge Road, Harold felt Dorothy's hand tighten on his. The last time they'd driven this road, they'd been desperate retirees gambling on a future. Now they were witnesses in the biggest criminal case Oregon had seen in decades, driving toward either vindication or death. The Cliff House loomed ahead, exactly as they'd left it. But as they pulled into the driveway, Harold saw what he'd missed before. Security cameras, small and discreet, mounted on trees, on the house itself, covering every angle. Someone had been watching this place for 40 years, maintaining it, protecting the evidence inside. Chen and Garrett swept the house room by room, checking for intruders, for traps. They found nothing but dust and silence and 290 million reasons for violence. By 10:30, the first news van arrived. A reporter from Portland's KDWW, young and eager, eyes going wide when she saw the Cliff House. Chen met her at the door, laid out ground rules. No filming inside until noon. No questions until noon. Just wait. More vans arrived. The Oregonian, Willamette Week, local stations from Salem and Eugene, even a national crew, CNN, who'd been in Portland covering a different story and caught wind of something big breaking. They set up cameras, lights, microphones, turned the Cliff House driveway into a media circus. Harold watched from a window, stomach churning. They were committed now, no backing out. At 11:45, 3 black SUVs rolled up the driveway. Harold's breath caught. This was it. Salazar had come. The vehicles parked, and men in expensive suits climbed out. Bodyguards, lawyers, the infrastructure of wealth and power. And then, from the middle SUV, Vincent Salazar himself emerged. He was 78 but looked 60, silver hair perfectly styled. Suit that probably cost more than Harold's truck. He moved like someone who'd never had to ask permission for anything in his life. Salazar approached the front steps where Chen stood waiting. Cameras were already rolling, reporters pressing forward. "Detective Chen," Salazar said, his voice smooth as oil. "I hope you have a very good lawyer, because when this is over, I'm going to own your pension, your house, and anything else you've ever valued." Chen smiled. "Feel free to try, Mr. Salazar. But first, let's show everyone why you're really here." She opened the front door wide, invited the cameras inside. Harold and Dorothy stood in the foyer, ordinary people in an extraordinary moment, holding the files that would change everything. "My name is Harold Brennan," Harold said, his voice shaking slightly but clear. 43 days ago, my wife and I bought this property at auction for $3,500. What we found inside is evidence of the largest criminal conspiracy in Oregon history." He held up the insurance file, the one Aldridge had prepared before his murder. Marcus Aldridge, the man who built this house, was killed in January of 1985 to prevent him from testifying against the Salazar organization. But before he died, he documented everything, and he left it here, waiting for someone to find it. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes. Salazar's face had gone pale, then red, then carefully blank. "This is absurd," Salazar said. "Marcus Aldridge was a business associate who disappeared decades ago. Whatever this man thinks he found, it's clearly fabricated." "Then explain the vault," Dorothy said, stepping forward. Her voice was stronger than Harold had heard in months. "Explain the $290 million in cash, bonds, and gold stored in a chamber carved into the cliff beneath this house. Explain the cameras that have been watching this property for 40 years. Explain why the local sheriff, Wade Hollister, was paid $5,000 a month throughout the 1980s to provide protection and information." She held up the payment records. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the documentation, the dates, the amounts. Salazar's lawyer stepped forward. "My client has no knowledge of any vault or currency. This is clearly a scheme to extort money from a respected businessman." "Then let's go look," Chen said. "Right now, cameras rolling. Let's walk down to that vault and see what's there." The moment stretched tight. Salazar looked trapped, cornered. If he refused, he looked guilty. If he went, he'd be filmed standing next to evidence of his crimes. He chose pride over caution. "Fine," he said. "Let's end this charade." They walked through the house like a strange parade, Harold and Dorothy leading, Chen and Garrett flanking them, Salazar and his lawyers and bodyguards following, and behind them all, a dozen cameras capturing everything. They reached the library. Harold opened the hidden panel, revealed the stairs descending into darkness. The cameras couldn't follow down the narrow passage, but they filmed the entrance, the stone steps, the clear evidence of something hidden. Harold, Dorothy, Chen, Garrett, Salazar, and one lawyer descended. The bodyguards stayed above, uneasy. At the bottom, Harold hit the light switch he'd found on his second visit. Fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, revealing the vault in all its terrible glory. Salazar stopped at the bottom of the stairs, staring. The blood drained from his face. He looked at the boxes lining the walls, at the desk with the ledger, at the irrefutable proof that his life had been built on crimes he'd thought were buried forever. "This is a setup," he said, but his voice had lost its power. "You planted this." "We planted $290 million, Harold asked. "In 48 days? On a retired mechanic's pension?" Chen was filming on her phone, live streaming to a secure server. "Vincent Salazar, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering, racketeering, and accessory to murder in the death of Marcus Aldridge." Salazar's lawyer stepped forward. "You can't arrest him. You have no jurisdiction. This is all circumstantial." "The hell it is," Garrett said. He'd been searching while they talked, had found something hidden behind the desk. A leather journal, handwritten, titled, "Daily Operations Log, V. Salazar, Financial Controller." Vincent Salazar's own handwriting, his own records, 40 years of crimes documented in his own hand. Salazar lunged for the journal, but Garrett was faster, former military reflexes still sharp. He held it out of reach while Chen got it on camera, flipping through pages, showing dates, amounts, names. They climbed back up the stairs, Salazar between Chen and Garrett now, no longer a businessman, but a suspect. At the top, the media waited, cameras ready. "Vincent Salazar," Chen said clearly, for all the microphones to hear, "is under arrest. The evidence found in this house connects him to a criminal organization responsible for billions in laundered money, dozens of murders, and the corruption of public officials across the western United States." The cameras ate it up. Reporters shouted questions. Salazar's lawyers screamed about rights and procedures. But the images were already going out, live feeds to news stations, social media posts spreading like wildfire. Harold and Dorothy stood to the side, watching their lives transform in real time from desperate to historic. They'd done it. They'd exposed the truth. They'd survived. And then Harold saw it. One of Salazar's bodyguards, hand moving toward his jacket. Garrett saw it too, moved fast, putting himself between the bodyguard and Harold. "Don't," Garrett said quietly. "Not with this many witnesses." The bodyguard's hand stopped. Salazar was led away in handcuffs, still protesting, still threatening lawsuits and consequences. But the cameras had seen everything. The truth was out, and no amount of money or power could put it back in the vault. The press conference lasted 3 hours. Harold and Dorothy told their story to reporter after reporter. They showed the files, the records, the evidence. They explained how they'd bought a house for $3,500 and found justice for crimes that predated their marriage. By evening, it was the lead story on every news outlet in America. Elderly couple exposes massive criminal conspiracy. $290 million found in Cliff House vault. Corrupt officials arrested. The FBI announced a task force to investigate everyone connected to the original Salazar organization. Chen drove Harold and Dorothy back to Portland that night, to a real hotel this time, with security and room service and beds that didn't smell like fear. They collapsed together, exhausted beyond words. "What happens now?" Dorothy asked, staring at the ceiling. "Now we wait," Harold said, "for the trials, for the investigations, for whatever comes next." "And the money?" Harold was quiet for a long time. "That money's covered in blood. We don't want it. We never wanted it." Dorothy nodded. She'd been thinking the same thing. $290 million, and all they really wanted was to go home to their trailer, to their quiet life, to the small dreams they'd had before the world got so big and complicated. But home wasn't safe anymore. Their names were everywhere, their faces on television. They were heroes to some, targets to others. And even with Salazar arrested, they both knew the truth. This wasn't over, not really. Organizations like his didn't die, they adapted. And somewhere out there, someone was already planning their next move, figuring out how to silence the witnesses who'd caused so much damage. Harold held Dorothy close, listening to her breathe, feeling her heart beat steady against his chest. They'd survived this long. They'd keep surviving. They'd keep fighting. Because that's what you did when you stumbled onto something bigger than yourself. You didn't run. You didn't hide. You stood up, you spoke truth, and you trusted that somewhere in all the darkness there was still enough light to make a difference. And tomorrow they'd wake up and do it all again. They'd testify, they'd remember, they'd make sure that Marcus Aldridge's murder meant something, that the victims of the Salazar organization finally got their justice, that 2 retired mechanics from Crescent Bay reminded the world that ordinary people could still do extraordinary things. The Cliff House stood empty again that night, police tape across the doors, guards watching the vault. Inside, $290 million waited for lawyers and courts to decide its fate. But the real treasure, the truth, had already been set free. And that was worth more than all the money in the world. The trial of Vincent Salazar began 6 months after that press conference on the cliff. 6 months during which Harold and Dorothy lived in federal protection, moving between safe houses, never staying anywhere long enough to feel settled. 6 months of depositions, interviews, grand juries, and endless questions from lawyers who wanted to know every detail of every moment since they'd first turned that brass key. Agent Frank Torres had been found 3 days after his kidnapping, beaten but alive, dumped outside a hospital in Salem. The men who'd taken him were arrested within a week, and their testimony added to the mountain of evidence against Salazar. Torres spent 2 months recovering, then returned to work with a singular focus, making sure every person connected to the Salazar organization faced justice. Wade Hollister, the Crescent Bay sheriff who'd been on the payroll since 1983, cut a deal. He testified against Salazar in exchange for a reduced sentence, admitting to 42 years of looking the other way, of warning the organization when investigations got too close, of helping maintain the Cliff House as a vault for evidence that could destroy them all. His testimony revealed something Harold and Dorothy hadn't known. They weren't the first people to buy the property. Over the years, 6 others had won it at auction, each time for pennies on the dollar, and each time within weeks they'd mysteriously decided to sell it back to a shell company for a small profit. 2 had moved away suddenly. 1 had died in what was ruled an accident. The others simply got scared. Harold and Dorothy should have been number 7 on that list. They should have taken the easy money and run. But they hadn't. And that stubbornness, that refusal to back down, had broken a conspiracy that had survived for 4 decades. The trial was held in Portland's federal courthouse, a building that looked like a concrete fortress. Harold and Dorothy sat in the front row every day for 3 weeks, watching lawyers argue over evidence they'd found, listening to expert witnesses explain money laundering schemes they'd uncovered, seeing their ordinary lives dissected and analyzed for a jury of 12 strangers. Vincent Salazar sat at the defense table in expensive suits, his expression carefully neutral, but Harold could see the cracks. The man who'd walked onto the Cliff House property like he owned the world now looked smaller, older, trapped by his own arrogance and the meticulous records he'd kept. Because that was the thing about criminals who thought they were untouchable. They kept trophies. They documented their brilliance. Salazar's own journal, the one Garrett had found behind the desk, contained enough evidence to convict him 10 times over. He'd written about the Aldridge murder, about the payoffs, about the satisfaction of building an empire while everyone else played by the rules. His lawyers argued the journal was forged, that the money in the vault had been planted, that Harold and Dorothy were con artists who'd orchestrated an elaborate scheme. But the evidence was too vast, too detailed, too consistent with decades of other investigations into the organization. On day 19 of the trial, the prosecution called Harold Brennan to the stand. He walked to the witness box on his bad knee, the one that had given out when they'd fled the safe house, the one that would probably never fully heal. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. And then he looked at the jury and told them everything. He told them about being 72 years old and broke, about Dorothy's heart surgery and medical bills they couldn't pay, about seeing an auction notice for a property nobody wanted. He told them about finding the vault, about the cameras, about the fear that had consumed their lives since that moment. "We didn't want to be heroes," Harold said, his voice quiet but clear in the silent courtroom. "We just wanted to survive. But when you find something like that, when you see evidence of crimes that destroyed lives, you have a choice. You can look away and hope it doesn't destroy you too. Or you can stand up and say this isn't right, this ends now." He looked directly at Salazar. That man sitting there, he thought he could bury his crimes under money and time and intimidation. He thought ordinary people like me and my wife would be too scared or too stupid to stand against him. But he was wrong, because ordinary people are the only ones who can stand against men like him. We're the ones who have nothing to lose except our integrity, and we weren't willing to lose that. The defense attorney tried to shake his testimony on cross-examination, suggesting he and Dorothy had planned this, that they'd somehow known about the vault before buying the property. But Harold just shook his head. "I'm a mechanic," he said. "I fix engines. Before this, the most complicated thing I'd ever dealt with was a seized transmission. You think I could orchestrate a conspiracy involving the FBI, local police, and 4 decades of hidden evidence? I'm not that smart. I'm just that stubborn." The courtroom laughed. Even the judge smiled. And Harold saw something shift in the jury's eyes. They believed him. They saw what he and Dorothy were, regular people caught up in something extraordinary, who chose courage over safety. Dorothy testified the next day. She was more nervous than Harold, her hands shaking as she took the oath, but her voice grew stronger as she spoke. She talked about the night they'd found the vault, about reading Aldridge's letter to the FBI, about understanding that they were holding evidence of a murder. That man had been trying to do the right thing, Dorothy said, pointing to a photo of Marcus Aldridge entered as evidence. He was going to testify. He was going to expose all of them, and they killed him for it. His body was found in concrete, buried for 12 years before anyone knew where to look. His family never got closure. His courage was rewarded with violence. She paused, tears in her eyes. We knew what happened to people who stood against the Salazar organization. We knew we might end up like Aldridge. But we also knew that if we stayed silent, if we took the easy way out, we'd be just as guilty. We'd be helping them get away with it. The defense attorney asked her about the money. Isn't it true, Mrs. Brennan, that you and your husband stand to gain financially from this case? Dorothy looked at him with something close to pity. We don't want a penny of that money. It's covered in blood and broken lives. You couldn't pay me enough to touch it. But you've been offered a finder's fee by the federal government, haven't you? Yes, Dorothy admitted. 10% of recovered assets in cases like this. We've been told that could be as much as $29 million, the courtroom murmured. The defense attorney smiled, thinking he'd found his angle. $29 million is quite an incentive to fabricate evidence, isn't it? Dorothy shook her head. We've already told the government we don't want it. We've asked that any finder's fee be distributed to victims of the Salazar organization's crimes. Families who lost homes, businesses, loved ones, they deserve restitution. We deserve to go home and try to rebuild our lives. The attorney had no response to that. He sat down, and Dorothy stepped off the witness stand, her testimony complete. The trial concluded 3 days later. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. Harold and Dorothy weren't in the courtroom when the verdict was read. They were back at their current safe house, a bland apartment in Beaverton, watching it on television like everyone else. On count 1, conspiracy to commit money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. On count 2, racketeering, we find the defendant guilty. On count 3, accessory to murder in the death of Marcus Aldridge, we find the defendant guilty. Guilty on all 47 counts. Vincent Salazar, the man who'd built an empire on crime and maintained it for 4 decades, was going to prison for the rest of his life. Harold and Dorothy held each other and cried, not from joy exactly, but from relief. It was over. The testimony was done, the verdict delivered. They could finally go home, except they didn't have a home anymore. Their trailer had been sold while they were in protective custody, their belongings put in storage. Crescent Bay felt like a lifetime ago, a place they'd lived in another life as different people. Agent Torres visited them the night after the verdict. He looked better now. The bruises from his kidnapping faded, though he moved more carefully, like a man who'd learned his mortality. "Congratulations," he said, shaking Harold's hand. "You did it. You brought down one of the most corrupt organizations in the country's history." "We helped," Harold corrected. "You were investigating for 38 years. We just found the last piece." Torres smiled. "The most important piece. The evidence we could never locate. We knew it existed, but Salazar was too smart to keep it anywhere we could find it. Hiding it in plain sight, in a house he legally owned through shell companies, maintained but never visited. It was brilliant." "So what happens now?" Dorothy asked. "Now the trials continue. We've arrested 47 people connected to the organization. Local officials, business owners, lawyers who helped launder money. It's going to take years to prosecute them all, and we'll need you to testify in some of those cases." Harold nodded. "We'll do whatever's needed." Torres pulled out an envelope. The government also wants to discuss your finder's fee. I know you've said you don't want it, but legally you're entitled to compensation for your role in recovering assets. We meant what we said, Dorothy replied. We don't want blood money. What if it wasn't about you? Torres asked. What if you could use it to help others? There are victims of Salazar's organization all over the country, families destroyed by his crimes. What if you could give them something back? Harold and Dorothy looked at each other, a conversation happening in the silence between them. Finally, Harold spoke. We'd need to think about that. They thought about it for 3 weeks. They read victim impact statements from people who'd lost everything to the Salazar organization. A widow whose husband had been killed for refusing to cooperate. Families who'd lost their homes in fraudulent real estate schemes. Small business owners bankrupted by extortion. And they thought about their own lives, about being 72 and 68 years old with no home, no savings, and hearts that had been broken and rebuilt by what they'd been through. We could help people, Dorothy said one evening as they sat in the safe house apartment. Really help them. Not just expose crimes, but repair some of the damage. Harold nodded slowly. We could. But first, we need to figure out what to do with that house. The Cliff House. It sat empty still, a crime scene that had been processed and photographed and documented. The vault had been emptied, the $290 million seized as evidence and assets to be distributed to victims. The house itself, massive and beautiful and haunted, belonged to Harold and Dorothy Brennan. They drove back to Crescent Bay on a grey March morning, 8 months after they'd first bought the property. Torres came with them, along with Chen and Garrett, who'd become something like family through the shared trauma of the investigation. The house looked different now. Smaller somehow, without the weight of secrets pressing down on it. Police tape still crossed the front door, but Torres cut it away and they entered together. Inside, everything was as they'd left it. The tarps over furniture, the dust motes dancing in afternoon light. But the air felt lighter, cleaner. The house could breathe now that truth had been spoken within its walls. They walked through every room, Harold and Dorothy seeing it with new eyes. Not as a vault or crime scene, but as a structure, a building, a space that could be transformed into something good. What if we turned it into a center? Dorothy said, as they stood in the library where they'd first found the hidden vault entrance. A place to help people like us, seniors facing financial hardship, dealing with medical debt, trying to survive on fixed incomes. Harold looked around the massive room. We could do legal aid, financial counseling, support groups, use the money we recover to fund programs. You'd need to maintain the property, Torres pointed out. This place is expensive to run. Utilities, upkeep, property taxes. We take the minimum from the finder's fee, Harold said. Enough to cover costs and live modestly. The rest goes to victims and programs. Chen smiled. You're really going to do this? Turn down millions to run a charity out of a crime scene? It's not a crime scene anymore, Dorothy said firmly. It's a second chance. For us, for the people we can help. Marcus Aldridge tried to do the right thing and was murdered for it. We can honor that. We can make this place mean something other than greed and violence. Over the next 6 months, the transformation began. Harold and Dorothy worked with architects to convert the Cliff House into the Aldridge Brennan Center for senior support. The main floor became offices and meeting rooms. The second floor held counseling spaces and a library of legal and financial resources. The third floor, where Aldridge's command center had been, became an archive, preserving the history of the case so it would never be forgotten. The vault, carved into the cliff itself, was sealed but preserved. Tours could view it through reinforced glass, a reminder of what greed and corruption looked like and what ordinary courage could overcome. The center opened in October, 14 months after Harold and Dorothy had first bought the property for $3,500. The parking lot was full. News crews came back, documenting the transformation from crime scene to community resource. Victims of the Salazar organization were among the first to visit. A woman in her 60s whose family's restaurant had been destroyed by extortion in 1981 wept as she walked through the library. "You did this for us," she said to Dorothy. "You didn't have to, but you did." Dorothy hugged her. "We did it for everyone who stands up and gets knocked down. We did it because we were lucky enough to survive, and we have to use that luck for something good." The center provided free legal help for seniors facing foreclosure, medical debt negotiation, social security advocacy, estate planning. It offered support groups for people dealing with financial trauma, for widows and widowers navigating systems alone, for anyone who felt invisible in a world that valued youth and wealth. Harold, despite his bad knee and 73 years, worked the front desk 3 days a week. He'd fix the coffee maker when it broke, help people fill out forms, listen to their stories. Dorothy ran the support groups, her own experience with medical crisis and financial desperation, making her the perfect person to help others through similar struggles. They hired staff as funding allowed, young lawyers doing pro bono work, retired social workers, volunteers from Crescent Bay who'd watched the transformation and wanted to be part of it. The town itself changed slowly. The Aldridge Brennan Center brought attention, brought funding, brought hope to a community that had been dying along with its timber industry. Local businesses that had been hanging on by threads found new customers. The diner down the highway started getting tour groups who came to see the Cliff House and stayed for lunch. A bed and breakfast opened in town, run by a couple who'd lost their home in 2008 and rebuilt their lives through the center's programs. Crescent Bay became known for something other than its dying economy. It became the town where two ordinary people had done something extraordinary. Torres was promoted to special agent in charge of the FBI's organized crime division in Oregon. He made the Aldridge Brennan case study mandatory training for new agents. "This is what happens when you listen to witnesses," he told recruits. "When you believe ordinary people can be heroes." Harold and Dorothy Brennan had no reason to trust me, to trust the system, but they did. And because of that, we dismantled an organization that had operated with impunity for 40 years. Chen left the Portland Police Department and took a job as security director for the center. She'd been through too much with Harold and Dorothy to walk away. Her daughter, now 9 years old, volunteered at the center on weekends, helping organize the library, learning from her mother's example that doing the right thing mattered more than taking the easy path. Garrett, the retired marshal, became the center's unofficial guardian. He lived in town now, in a small house he'd bought with money saved from decades of service. Most days you could find him on the center's front steps, drinking coffee, chatting with visitors, and quietly making sure nobody with bad intentions got too close to the people he'd come to love. The legal battles continued for years. Salazar's assets were seized and distributed, his business empire dismantled. Shell companies that had hidden dirty money for decades were exposed and dissolved. The total recovery exceeded $400 million when all accounts were traced and frozen. Harold and Dorothy's finder's fee by law came to $40 million. They took $2 million, enough to live comfortably and maintain the center. The remaining $38 million was distributed to victim compensation funds. Families who'd lost loved ones to the organization's violence received settlements. People who'd been defrauded got restitution. Communities destroyed by the Salazar organization's corruption received grants to rebuild. Harold and Dorothy watched the money flow out to people who needed it and felt something like peace. They'd stumbled into fortune and given it away, and in doing so, they'd gained something worth more than any amount of money: purpose. The 1-year anniversary of Salazar's conviction fell on a crisp October morning. The center held a commemoration, inviting everyone who'd been part of the journey. Victims who'd testified, Agents who'd investigated, journalists who'd covered the story, the people of Crescent Bay who'd embraced the transformation. Harold stood at a podium set up in the center's main hall, Dorothy beside him, looking out at hundreds of faces. Some he knew, most he didn't. But all of them were connected now, woven together by a story that had started with a 75-cent auction notice and ended with justice. "A year ago," Harold began, his voice stronger than it had been in that courtroom, "my wife and I stood in a very different room and told the truth about what we'd found. Today, we stand here and see what truth can build." He gestured around the hall at the resources and support the center provided. Marcus Aldridge died trying to do the right thing. For 40 years, that sacrifice seemed meaningless. His murder unsolved, his killers free, his evidence buried. But nothing stays buried forever. Truth has a way of working itself to the surface. Dorothy took the microphone. "We're not special people. We're not brave or brilliant or extraordinary. We're just two mechanics who got lucky and made choices. We could have walked away. We probably should have. It would have been safer, easier, but we didn't. And that's the lesson we want to share." She looked out at the audience, her eyes finding the faces of victims who'd become friends, of staff who'd become family, of a community that had rallied around them. Ordinary people can change the world. You don't need power or wealth or connections. You just need to see something wrong and refuse to accept it. You need to stand up even when you're scared, especially when you're scared. The audience rose in applause, but Harold and Dorothy weren't finished. They'd prepared something special for this moment. Garrett wheeled out a covered object on a dolly. Harold pulled away the cloth to reveal a bronze plaque, 2 feet by 3 feet, engraved with words they'd spent weeks perfecting. "This will hang in the vault viewing area," Harold explained, "so everyone who comes here understands what this place represents." He read the inscription aloud. "In memory of Marcus Aldridge, who died defending truth. In honor of all victims of the Salazar organization, who suffered in silence for too long. And in testament to the power of ordinary courage, which can overcome extraordinary evil. This center stands as proof that justice delayed is not justice denied. It just takes people brave enough to demand it." Tears flowed freely through the audience. A woman Harold recognized from the trial, the daughter of one of Aldridge's business partners who'd been killed in 1983, approached the plaque and placed her hand on it. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving my father's death meaning, for making sure they didn't win." The reception lasted hours. People shared stories, old and new. They talked about the trials still ongoing, the convictions still being secured, the corruption still being rooted out. The Aldridge-Brennan case had opened doors to dozens of other investigations. Cold cases were being reopened. Victims were coming forward who'd been too scared before. As the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Harold and Dorothy stood on the cliff house deck, looking out at the ocean. The same view Aldridge must have had when he built this place, when he thought he could hide his crimes in beauty and isolation. "Do you ever regret it?" Dorothy asked quietly. "Everything we went through, everything we lost." Harold thought about their old trailer, sold to pay legal fees, about the simple life they'd had before, when their biggest worry was the electric bill, about the fear and danger and exhaustion of the past year and a half. "No," he said finally, "we lost small things and gained big ones. We lost safety and found purpose. And anyway, we didn't lose each other. That's all that really mattered." Dorothy leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. They'd both aged in this journey. Harold's hair had gone from grey to white. Dorothy's heart required more medication now, the stress having taken its toll. But they were still standing, still together, still fighting for something that mattered. Inside, the party continued. Laughter and conversation drifting out through open windows. The cliff house, built for greed and secrecy, had become a place of openness and healing. The vault that had held blood money now held the memory of what courage looked like. And somewhere, in a federal prison, Vincent Salazar sat in a cell, his empire destroyed, his name synonymous with corruption. He'd thought he could bury his crimes under enough money and time. He'd been wrong, because two retired mechanics with $3,500 and more courage than sense had refused to let the past stay buried. A month later, Harold and Dorothy finally made it back to something like normal life. They'd found a small cottage in Crescent Bay, modest and comfortable, with a view of the ocean and a front porch where they could sit in the evenings. They'd furnished it simply, things they needed but nothing extravagant. After everything they'd been through, luxury felt hollow. Harold still worked on cars sometimes, in a small garage he'd set up behind the cottage. Not for money, though people tried to pay him, just for the satisfaction of fixing things, of taking something broken and making it whole again. It was meditative, the work his hands remembered even when his mind was tired. Dorothy volunteered at the center 4 days a week. She'd started a support group specifically for people dealing with medical debt, sharing her own story of heart surgery and bills they couldn't pay, of the fear that had driven them to that auction in the first place. "If that hadn't happened," she told the group one evening, "if I hadn't gotten sick and we hadn't been desperate, we never would have bought that house. We never would have found the evidence. All those people would still be waiting for justice." One of the group members, a man in his 60s dealing with cancer treatment costs, spoke up. "So you're saying your illness was a blessing?" Dorothy shook her head. "No. It was terrifying and painful, and it almost killed me. But what came from it, what we were able to do because of the path it set us on, that was a blessing. Suffering doesn't have to be meaningless. Sometimes it opens doors we didn't know existed." Word of the center's work spread. Articles were written, not just about the criminal case, but about what had been built in its aftermath. A documentary crew came to film Harold and Dorothy to capture their story before age and time could blur it. "Why did you do it?" the filmmaker asked Harold as cameras rolled. "When you could have walked away, when you could have taken the money and disappeared, what made you stay and fight?" Harold thought about that question for a long time. "I think," he finally said, "it's because running away would have meant they won. Salazar and everyone like him, they count on ordinary people being too scared or too tired or too beaten down to fight back. They've built their whole system on that assumption. And Dorothy and I, we'd been beaten down our whole lives. Working jobs that didn't pay enough, watching people with money and power get away with things we never could, feeling invisible." He paused, looking at Dorothy, who sat beside him. "But when we found that evidence, when we realized what we were holding, we stopped being invisible. We became dangerous to them. And that felt good. It felt like for once in our lives we mattered. We could make a difference, so we did." The documentary aired on PBS to strong viewings and critical acclaim. It won awards Harold and Dorothy didn't understand and didn't particularly care about. But what mattered was the response. Letters poured into the center from people across the country who'd seen the film and felt inspired. One letter came from a woman in Ohio who'd been fighting a fraudulent foreclosure for 5 years. "I was ready to give up," she wrote. "I thought I couldn't win against the bank's lawyers. But after seeing what you did, what you fought against, I found the courage to keep going. I just won my case. I get to keep my home. Thank you for showing me that ordinary people can still win." Harold pinned that letter to his garage wall, next to a photo of the Cliff House and the brass key that had started everything. On their 50th wedding anniversary, Harold and Dorothy renewed their vows in a small ceremony at the center. Torres officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. Chen and Garrett stood as witnesses. The center's staff and regular visitors filled the hall. 50 years ago, Harold said, as part of his vows, "I promised to love you through whatever came. I thought that meant the normal stuff. bills and kids and getting old together. I never imagined it would mean running from criminals, testifying in federal court, or starting a non-profit in our 70s. But I'm glad it did, because going through all of that with you showed me what our love actually means. It's not just comfort, it's courage. It's choosing to stand together even when the world tells us to run. Dorothy's vows were simpler. I love you, Harold Brennan. I loved you when we were broke and scared. I love you now that we're slightly less broke and slightly less scared. And I'll love you through whatever comes next, even if it's just quiet evenings on our porch. Especially if it's just quiet evenings on our porch. The reception featured a cake donated by the local bakery and music from a band that played for free. People danced, told stories, celebrated not just a marriage but a journey that had transformed a community. Late in the evening, as the party wound down, Harold and Dorothy stood again on the Cliff House deck. The ocean stretched before them, vast and dark, stars beginning to emerge in the deepening sky. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Dorothy said. "All the people who bought this property before us, the ones who got scared and sold. I wonder if they ever found out what they almost discovered, if they ever regretted walking away." "Probably," Harold said. "But you can't blame them for being scared. We were terrified. But we didn't run." "No," Harold agreed. "We didn't run." They stood in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from 5 decades of marriage and 18 months of shared trauma. Below them, the Pacific crashed against the rocks, eternal and indifferent. Above them, stars wheeled slowly across the sky, same as they had for billions of years. And between earth and heaven, 2 ordinary people who'd done something extraordinary simply existed, content in the knowledge that they'd made a choice and lived with its consequences and emerged on the other side as better versions of themselves. The Aldridge Brennan Center thrived. In its 2nd year, it helped over 800 families navigate financial crises. It prevented 43 foreclosures. It provided legal representation in 37 debt cases, winning 35 of them. It gave people what Harold and Dorothy had stumbled into by accident: a second chance. Harold's health declined slowly. The bad knee required surgery, then a replacement. His heart, stressed by months of fear and adrenaline, developed arrhythmia that required medication and careful monitoring. But he kept working, kept helping, kept showing up. Dorothy's condition was more serious. The stress of their ordeal had weakened her heart further. By the 3rd anniversary of buying the Cliff House, she required a pacemaker. The surgery went well, but recovery was slow. Harold sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand, watching her sleep. They were 75 and 71 now, mortality no longer an abstract concept, but a companion sitting patiently in the corner, waiting. "We did good, didn't we?" Dorothy asked one evening, awake now, her voice weak but clear. "We did better than good," Harold replied. "We did what mattered." She smiled. "All because we bought a house for $3,500. Best investment we ever made." They laughed together, the sound thin but genuine. Outside the hospital window, Crescent Bay spread out below them, lights beginning to glow as evening settled in. Somewhere in that town, the center was closing for the day. Staff were locking up, volunteers were heading home, people who'd been helped were going back to their lives a little more hopeful than when they'd arrived. And somewhere in federal prisons scattered across the country, 47 people convicted in the Aldridge Brennan case served sentences they'd thought they'd escaped. Every day they woke up behind bars was a reminder that justice might be slow, but it was possible. Anyone can change the world if they're brave enough to stand their ground when it matters most. Harold and Dorothy Brennan proved that truth isn't about having the most money or the most power. It's about having the courage to speak it, even when silence would be safer. They were just 2 retired mechanics who bought a house on a cliff and found themselves at the center of the biggest criminal conspiracy Oregon had ever seen. They could have walked away. They should have. But they didn't. Because sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest truth. And sometimes a $3,500 investment in a forgotten property becomes an investment in justice itself. 5 years after buying the Cliff House, Harold stood at Dorothy's grave in the Crescent Bay Cemetery. She'd passed quietly in her sleep 6 months earlier, her heart finally giving out after years of strain and courage. The funeral had been massive, hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched, whose burdens she'd helped carry. The headstone was simple. Dorothy Brennan, 1956 to 2031, she stood when others ran. Harold visited every day, bringing flowers from their cottage garden, telling her about the center's latest successes, about the families they were helping, about the ongoing trials of Salazar's associates. He talked to her like she was still there, because in all the ways that mattered, she was. "We helped a young couple this week," he told her on a grey March morning, the anniversary of the day they'd first entered the Cliff House. They were about to lose their home, medical debt from their daughter's cancer treatment. We connected them with a lawyer, negotiated with the hospital, got the debt reduced by 80%. They get to keep their house. They get to keep their family together. He paused, wiping his eyes. "You would have loved them. Reminded me of us 50 years ago. Just trying to survive, just trying to do right by the people they love." A hand touched his shoulder. Harold turned to find Torres standing there, older now, grey at the temples, but still the same determined agent who'd believed them when no one else would. "Thought I'd find you here," Torres said. They stood together in silence for a while, two old men paying respects to a woman who'd changed both their lives. "The last of the trials wrapped up yesterday," Torres finally said. "Every single person connected to the Salazar organization who was still alive has been convicted. 47 convictions, 0 acquittals. It's over, Harold. You and Dorothy did it." Harold nodded slowly. "She should be here to see it." "She is seeing it," Torres replied. "Wherever she is, she knows, and she's proud." That evening the center held a ceremony. Not to celebrate the end of the trials exactly, but to mark the transformation that had occurred. 5 years of healing, of helping, of proving that something good could be built on the ruins of something terrible. Harold spoke briefly, his voice carrying across the crowded hall. "My wife and I bought a house because we were desperate. We exposed criminals because we were stubborn. We built this center because we believed broken things could be fixed. Dorothy's not here to see how far we've come, but her spirit is in every person we help, every family we save from the kind of fear and desperation we knew too well." He unveiled a portrait of Dorothy, painted by a local artist, showing her as she'd been at the trial, fierce and determined and unbreakable. It would hang in the center's main hall, a reminder of what courage looked like. "This place exists because one woman refused to stay silent," Harold continued. "Because she looked at $290 million in blood money and said, 'We don't want it, we want justice.' Because she believed ordinary people could still matter in a world built for the powerful. She was right, and as long as this center stands, her courage stands with it." The applause was thunderous, but Harold barely heard it. He was looking at the portrait, at Dorothy's painted eyes, and remembering the moment they'd first descended into that vault. The fear, the awe, the choice they'd made to do the right thing even when it terrified them. Harold Brennan lived to be 83 years old. He worked at the center until the month before he died, helping people navigate systems designed to confuse them, fixing problems with patience and care. His last words were reportedly to a young family facing foreclosure. "Don't give up. There's always a way forward if you're brave enough to find it." He was buried beside Dorothy, their shared headstone reading, "Harold and Dorothy Brennan. They bought a house and found justice." The Aldridge Brennan Center continued long after both founders had passed. It expanded, opening satellite offices in other coastal towns facing similar economic hardships. The model they'd created, using recovered criminal assets to fund victim support, was adopted across the country. The Cliff House became a national historic site, a place where schoolchildren learned about corruption and courage, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And in Crescent Bay, on quiet evenings when the fog rolled in off the Pacific, people would sometimes drive up Coast Ridge Road to look at the house on the cliff. They'd remember the story of two retired mechanics who'd spent $3,500 and changed the world. They'd think about Harold and Dorothy Brennan, and they'd wonder if they would have had the same courage, the same stubborn refusal to accept injustice. Most people hoped they would. Some people knew they wouldn't. But everyone agreed on one thing. The world needed more people like the Brennans, people who looked at overwhelming corruption and impossible odds and said, "Not on my watch." Because in the end, that's what heroism really is. Not superpowers or weapons or wealth. Just ordinary people making hard choices and living with the consequences. Just two mechanics with grease under their nails and hope in their hearts, refusing to let evil hide in shadows. The story of Harold and Dorothy Brennan isn't really about money or crime or courtrooms. It's about what happens when regular people refuse to be silent. It's about finding courage you didn't know you had when circumstances demand it. It's about standing together when the world tries to push you apart. And it's about leaving behind something better than what you found, even if it costs you everything. They bought a house for $3,500. What they really bought was a chance to matter, to make a difference, to prove that justice wasn't just for the rich and powerful. And they seized that chance with both hands, held on through fear and danger and exhaustion, and never let go. Anyone can change the world if they're willing to stand their ground and speak truth, even when it's easier to stay silent. Harold and Dorothy Brennan were just two people who took that chance and showed us all what's possible when ordinary courage meets extraordinary circumstance. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the truth deserves a voice and ordinary people can still do extraordinary things.